the Gollum-ass picture of Andrew Tate, all of these moments where you can just point out that the guy's a loser. He really is, like, to his core. Do you have a favorite insult regarding Andrew Tate?
Um, so like, part of me is like, even his nicknames are just so cringe that
Yeah.
they're like a self-own sometimes.
They are.
But my favorite one is actually in our data. There's a teacher that talks about his followers as tater tots.
Yeah.
Um, and just deep in my soul, that makes me laugh. Just thinking about them as tater tots. And for some reason, that makes me think of him as just like a big tater tot with arms.
I love that.
Uh, which, I mean, and that's just that's a funny picture in my head.
He kind of
And
looks like
sometimes I
Mr.
need
Potato
that to
Head
like,
sometimes. So I can
oh,
see it,
that's good.
Hello, I'm Rachel Gilmore, your least favorite person's least favorite journalist. Welcome to Bubble Pop, a weekly show where we break down the biggest headlines and juiciest news tidbits so you don't have to doom scroll. Today we're talking about something that makes me want to vomit, the manosphere. Unfortunately, a growing number of worryingly popular misogynistic influencers make their money by telling men to hate women. While it's hard to imagine this wouldn't have an offline impact, research is emerging that is starting to tell us just how bad that impact really is. A new paper from Emelia Sandau and Luc Cousineau, published recently in the journal Gender and Education, is one of the articles that paints that picture. Titled "Trying to Talk White Male Teenagers Off the Alt-Right Ledge and Other Impacts of Masculinist Influencers on Teachers," the researchers used data collected from the teachers subreddit community on reddit.com to dig into how users describe the influences of a resurging misogyny on the jobs of teachers in the classroom. Since those teachers are on the front lines, being bombarded with the rhetoric these kids are learning from manosphere douchebags. The researchers found that students are, quote, actively parroting male supremacist rhetorics at school, and that is serving to devalue women teachers and make classrooms less safe. In the end, the researchers concluded there is cause for concern regarding the, quote, immediate impacts as well as long-term consequences of masculinist and male supremacist ideologies on youth, teachers, and schools. As a result, the Canadian Anti-Hate Network has launched a petition that you can sign right now against male supremacy, violence, and harassment in Canadian schools. I'll have the link in the description for today's episode. Now, to help us dig deeper into this seriously scary issue, I am thrilled to have one of the researchers behind this new paper on the show. Luc Cousineau is the co-founder of the Canadian Institute for Far-Right Studies and an instructor at Dalhousie University. He's an expert on several issues, including men's rights groups and far-right extremism. All of this makes him an excellent resource for helping us to understand the scary side of the influencer world, one that is having real offline impacts. For all those reasons, I am so excited to welcome him on the show. Luc, welcome to Bubble Pop.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited. I'm like, this topic is one that I think is so important right now. And it's like very fascinating in a very scary way. So I'm excited to talk to you about it. I I do want to start with a big question because we might have some viewers here, some listeners who are blissfully unaware of the world that you've spent so much time researching and that I've unfortunately dipped my toe into as well. Could you explain, like, what is the manosphere?
Oh, the bliss of not knowing
I
the
know.
answer to that question.
Yeah, I know. And I'm sorry, listeners, that now you're about to get it. So take
Yeah.
it away now.
So yeah, I maybe blissful not to know, but I think important to know. And so
Yeah.
there's a few ways that we explain what the manosphere is, but the kind of easiest way is to understand that the manosphere is kind of a loose collection of different ideological groups, and their sort of unifying focus is generally anti-feminism. But that extends in all directions. So sometimes it is anti-women, period. Sometimes it is anti-equity. Sometimes it is anti custody court, for example. And so in the manosphere, you're going to find a bunch of different groups, again, loosely aligned. So you might have men's rights in there. You might have the red pill, which is this movement about like kind of finding alpha masculinity through going to the gym and being rude to women and other bad stuff. You're going to find some people would put incels in there. I think if you asked a lot of incels, they say, no, we're not part of the manosphere, but they kind of fit in there different ways. There's a group called MGTOW, which is men going their own way. That's the real sort of anti-women. We don't need women at all in our lives. And then some other groups in there too, and sort of subsets of those groups. Sometimes we might find NoFap in there, which is a no masturbation thing. Your viewers can look that up if they're interested in it. That's not my area of expertise as a researcher, but there are folks who do research that particular subgroup, and they're sort of loosely connected. Again, mostly by anti-feminism, and so it's a big cluster of folks. I mean, they're hard to describe. And then you have sort of surrounding the cluster, what we might call this sort of masculinist, grifter sphere, who make money and often prey on these folks. And they're embedded in these communities, but also it's on, pickup artists. Speaking of grifters, pickup artists definitely fit in there as well. So, a bunch of different groups that really don't like women most of the time.
Yeah, I think I actually had an encounter with a pickup artist back when I was a waitress. And it turned out later that this guy was going around and like filming women that he was hitting on without asking. And I don't know if he filmed our interaction, but I just remember he was really gross. And I was like, 18, 19, like so young. Anyways, just like a very greasy world. And it kind of exists like, so what you were describing too, like there's communities and there's like influencers. So is it mostly on social media? Is it more forum based? Is it more like figurehead based? Like, or is it kind of everything? Because it sounds like it's a really broad movement.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to answer yes. Because it is, and no, it's all of those things, and certainly in person. And so communities like the pickup artist community, while there remains a significant pickup artist community online, they had a big like sort of in person thing through the 90s, especially, and centered around a book. I mean, we don't need to go too deep into it because I don't want people to go and find and buy that book. It's awful. But I mean, you have these big sort of in-person movements, and a lot of the current movements actually grow out of those. And so like through the late 70s and the 80s, you had the mythopoetic men's movement, which is think like loincloths in the forest and like banging drums and howling to the masculine moon and stuff. Like, it's a real like sort of finding true masculinity in that space, and those were in-person meetings, sort of pre everybody being on the internet all the time. Now we're seeing still some certainly in person, and this is manifesting in person, but forums, social media sites like certainly Reddit for people doing interactive stuff, and then like just an overwhelming amount of content on TikTok and YouTube and Instagram, as sort of more one-way content where people might interact after, but the sort of influencers and the producers of that content are sort of producing it and loosing it into the world.
Awesome. So great.
Isn't it just a delight?
Yeah, just a smorgasbord. It's just anywhere you turn, you can find some. One thing that I find confusing, probably in part because like I'm a woman, so it's not exactly designed to appeal to me. But like I don't understand how this became such a popular style of content when it's so disgusting, and like why some young men specifically are so drawn to it. What's been your impression of that, the answer to that? And I know it's hard because it's a broad movement with like a lot of different iterations, but are there any themes that you've noticed?
Yeah, I mean, that's a super important question, right? And part of the reason why folks like me spend their time and energy looking at groups like this and their effects, it is important to do a little bit of splitting apart, right? Because I think that what draws folks to, say, the incel movement can be quite different than what might draw them to the red pill or other content, other sort of misogynist content, but that isn't sort of based on involuntary celibacy and that sort of thing. They remain linked. To get really academic real quick here, it's really a complicated set of social phenomenon. What it kind of boils down to, and you see this in other studies of extremism as well, is sort of looking for sense of self and looking for belonging. In a lot of times, that's, I mean, what brings people into the group setting, certainly. But on an individual level, especially if you look at a lot of the incel exit work, talking to formers from these groups, or even sort of people that are currently in there, one of the things that young men are looking for in particular is somebody to tell them how to be a man today, right? And if you are, if you represent like I do, I'm a cishet white guy, I look like this. And so if I'm being told that, other people need to have opportunities, that means that didn't, well, didn't I have all of these opportunities before? And doesn't that mean that I'm losing because of it? Right. There's some really complicated social things going on around seeing sort of power and privilege and access as zero sum. And so if somebody else is getting some of that, then I'm getting less. So I might get aggrieved, right? Like, so there's these layers of like aggrievement, of feeling loss, of just sort of not giving a shit about other people sometimes, right? And that comes under capitalism, that's right. Like, there's all of these really complex social layers, but we have especially the younger men looking for role models. And then if the role models they're fed through the fire hose of media that they're getting are all saying this, then, oh, I guess that's how I should do it. And so there's, it's really complicated. There's a lot of sort of nuance and individuality there. Some folks can't, some young men aren't going to be able to achieve the sort of idealized masculinity, and that might push them into the incel community, for example. And, the extreme of that is really nihilistic. That's where we find the extreme violence. And so, I mean, I've given you kind of a long and convoluted answer, but the reason for that is that if we don't start right at the beginning, being like, this is really, really complicated, and we have to spend some time thinking and talking about the elements of that and why it's so complicated, we can never get anywhere in our discussion about, well, like, because, eventually we have to come around to like, well, what do we do about it?
Yeah.
And if we're not willing to acknowledge that it's really, really complicated, then we can never come to the right kind of answer, because you can't solve a really complicated problem with a single response. It can't work that way. It won't ever. And we have lots of evidence to demonstrate that. And so I don't mean to sort of drag it on and have people go like, oh man, this guy like really went down the hole right away.
No, you're good.
It is that complicated.
Yeah.
And you need to understand that like right from hop. So
totally. And, one thing that kind of struck me when you're going through these sort of definitions and the different ways that this manifests itself and what draws people to it is, this doesn't sound like, I mean, I thought that in some ways this was a relatively new phenomenon, but it sounds like there's been something going on for decades where, there has been this sort of masculinist theme in a lot of these, I guess with men, period. And is there anything like, because it feels like it's really reaching a fever pitch right now. And I think that in some ways your paper does describe that teachers are seeing this rise. Is maybe this is a chicken or egg question, but like, is there something unique to this moment that is prompting more young men to feel like they need to seek out these behaviors, or are they seeking out these sort of influences or these, communities because they exist in the first place and they're being like fire hosed with them? Like, is it more them seeking it out, or is it more that they can't get away from it?
So I mean, good. I think good that you sort of qualify that as sort of a chicken or egg question.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is an answer to that question a little
Mm,
bit, which is yes, these things have existed. We can kind of trace the history of the sort of men's rights movement really directly. From sort of the late 60s, mid 70s in particular, we can like do that work, and there's some great writing that people can read about how this sort of men's rights movement comes to be, and all of this stuff kind of pulls out of there. And it's all boiling under the surface. What changes and what allows this kind of what I'd call a resurgence. So it's not a surge that we're seeing now. It's a
yeah.
resurgence of these ideas that have existed there. Just like, I mean, we're seeing uncloseted fascism in the United States. This isn't a new thing that never existed in the US before, right? Like this is just a resurgence of that. And we're seeing sort of the same thing here. And what allows for the resurgence of this like really sort of more hardcore misogynist and masculinist movement now is absolutely the media landscape that it gets to
Mm,
exist in. And so we are in this position now where if you look at the internet use data, for example, so we have there's decent data out of the United States talking about like where people are getting their media, right? And more our news content is coming off social media rather than sort of legacy media outlets. And our social media landscape is absolutely a fire hose. It's a great analogy to understand. If people have never sort of handled or seen a fire hose, it's just like so much content, so much water, right? Like if you don't have several
yeah.
people to hold on to it, you're going to get knocked over. This is true of our social media content. It's like sort of an unhandleable amount of content. That content is produced on and controlled by companies, private companies, whose impetus and drive is to make money. And so both funding the production of content and what content gets eyes on, it is content that sort of feeds the machine. And so well, we can't say for sure kind of what comes first. Is it the idea, or is it its sort of existence as a social phenomenon as we see it? We can track really closely what we're talking about now, at least in theory. We can sort of track that to an overwhelming volume of media content that is algorithmically controlled, right? The algorithm's job is to keep you watching, and that doesn't care if you're like, I love all of this, or I hate all of this and it makes me so angry. It doesn't care. In fact, it kind of likes the bit that makes you angry, because if it makes you angry, there's also somebody that likes it. And so that's double the eyeballs, right? And so you also see as we had Vine, and then Vine kind of went away, and then it just came back and it's called TikTok now. But like we have this shorter version of content. And one of the reasons why some of the guys in the sort of masculinist sphere come into real prominence, like Andrew Tate, is he figured it out. I wrote a piece in the Conversation in 2022 about how there's not one piece of messaging that guy has that is new at all. It's old and it's tired and it's boring. What he was really good at, and now we're going back, 3 years, is designing content for the media platforms that he was trying to get on. So doing YouTube videos, but making them so you could cut them up easily, saying to his followers, take my videos, cut them up, post them elsewhere. And then he was everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that really interesting, actually. In the paper that you published, the fact that Andrew Tate was banned from most platforms, but as you explained, that didn't stop his rise. Like, um, he had all those clips going everywhere, and you couldn't escape him. And I think it was an interesting sort of I guess, challenge. I don't want to give them too much. I don't think that social media companies feel a huge impetus to actually deal with these things. So I don't want to act like they, were grappling and struggling with this. But oddly enough, like if you say Andrew Tate's name in content, even if it's critical, that can sometimes get flagged. But then these videos of him will go super viral. It's just, I think that they don't always handle it super well, but to say the least. But could you explain, like, I guess, I mean, you kind of just answered it, but like why he was able to be so successful despite his deplatforming, and what challenges this presents for dealing with these kinds of influencers? Because if we can't deplatform them, like, what do we do?
So, I mean, this brings up a couple of questions, right? And we're sort of into content moderation, which
Yeah.
is not my area of study, but something that I absolutely can't get away from because I
Yeah.
study, men's rights communities and red pill communities, other contentious communities online. So the idea of content moderation is sort of ever present. And the question that we should be asking, both sort of as citizens or as policymakers, folks out there, parents, for sure, is the content moderation that's happening, if it's happening. So let's be really clear, right? The big American social media companies post Trump 2 election were like, oh, we don't have to do that anymore. We're just
Yeah.
gonna quit. And on your episode with Amar, actually, he made a really good point that we were headed in quite a good direction with content moderation. And then Trump gets elected for the second time and all the social media companies goes, great, we can save a bunch of money by just like not doing this anymore. And we're probably fine if there's more Nazis or whatever. Clearly they were.
Yeah.
Right. But content moderation, the first thing we have to ask is this a performative act? And so the technologies behind these platforms are, I mean, it's really hard for a layperson to understand. It's really hard for me to understand. I've been reading about them for years, the power that they have. So when they do content moderation and sort of banning of Andrew Tate, for example, they're not banning Tate's likeness necessarily. They're banning content produced by him. And so if you've spent, as he did, an entire year, which doesn't sound very long, but in a social media ecosystem, that's like forever, telling all of your followers, you can take my content, you can post it up elsewhere, chop it up, like use these I'm sort of recording in these little clips. And if I ever get banned, post it more. Well, when you ban him, then that's exactly what happens, right? He has this
Yeah.
following that's going to do that. And so then does the banning of that become a performative act? Do I think that is something we should never do? Like, should we not ban content? Of course not. We should absolutely ban content, right? Like, there are things that shouldn't just sort of live willy-nilly on the internet that everybody, including children, can access, right? Like, that's something socially that we need to do. But are there more effective ways to do it? And so that, I mean, that's kind of the first thing around content moderation. I mean, he set himself up. So if I ever get banned,
Yeah.
no big deal. And it drives traffic towards his, really lucrative other money-making operations. Secondly, and this is sort of a more nuanced kind of academic response, but one that I think is really important, is that not all of his content is violently misogynistic. And
Mhm.
that's really, really important. It's sort of the same thing if you go back a number of years to kind of an older set, the same thing that we had with Jordan Peterson, right? Not all of his stuff was insane. Right? And this creates a really sort of complicated way for us to need to understand it. So if we're talking about Tate, he's got videos that are going to say, and like, regardless of what you think of the guy, like, he's clearly in pretty decent shape. And he says, if you want to be in shape like me, it's going to be work. There's no magic pill. There's no nothing. You're going to have to work hard to make your body look like this. That's not a message that is contentious on its face, right? If
Yeah.
the underlying message is, so then you can do all of these horrible things and, like, do sexual assault and stuff, then that's a
Yeah.
problem on its own. But the message of, like, if you want to have a fit body, this kind of body, you're going to have to work hard. that's not a contentious message, really. Apologies to any of my disabilities or fat studies colleagues who might be listening. But like, socially is sort of a thing. And so when all of the content isn't violently misogynistic, now we've got a real sort of dance happening, right?
Yeah.
Because I might, as a young person, come onto this content and be like, oh, I'm interested in getting a kickboxer's body, right? Because he's a former kickboxer. And I wind up on this thing. He's like, you're going to work hard. Here's some workout tips. Oh, okay. I can get with this guy. And then I get other content. Right. And so I think part of it is that if all of his content was violently misogynistic, he would have got banned super fast. It would have been gone. But it's not.
Yeah.
And so that allows for kind of a loophole into the social media ecosystem. And it creates, what I've been calling kind of soft entree points. It's sort of the easy way in to this space for people. And that's a really complicated thing to try and monitor, to police if necessary. Because can we say, well, you can't post your workout content because you did a misogyny over here? Now I'm grossly oversimplifying. He didn't do a misogyny, right? Like,
no, but I know what you mean. It's accurate. It's like, yeah, it's how do you navigate the stuff that doesn't violate community guidelines and stuff? And it's very true. Like, that's something I've encountered a ton over the years, particularly when I speak about someone like, say, Jordan Peterson or any of these guys. Like, people will say, oh, you're misunderstanding. That's not what he means. Listen to this stuff. And then they'll send you some stuff that seems pretty, like, I mean, even Jordan Peterson's initial book, 12 Rules for Life or whatever, like, it wasn't that. I haven't read it, so full disclosure there. I don't really have an interest in reading about lobsters and making my bed because I don't eat lobsters and I do make my bed, so I'm kind of good in both respects. But I from what I understand, it wasn't a super controversial book. It was actually quite helpful for a lot of people. And those are, as you mentioned, these soft entry points. And it also makes it really difficult to navigate even interpersonally, because when you try to have discussions about why something's problematic, there's so many examples this person can point to that aren't problematic, but the absence of problematic behavior in a single clip doesn't equate to an individual not engaging in problematic rhetoric in general. So it's a hard thing. Yeah.
And I think it's situationally contingent as well. And what I mean by that is, so we're talking about two peoples in Tate and Peterson, for example, whose like big bailiwicks are, Peterson sort of comes to prominence because he's like, doing pronouns is annoying. And people are like, yeah, I'm annoyed by that too. And Tate, well, Tate's doing violent misogyny, which should be more problematic than it is. And for people that are like, well, you can't ignore these things that aren't, see all these things that aren't that. If they were doing racial slurs, like if 40% of their content was just like gratuitous racial slurs, they would be written off immediately. And so we have this real problem with being like, oh, well, this is just violence against women. That's fine. Right? Or like, this is just violence against the queer community. That's fine. Right? And so we have some real issues here around how we view particular types of violence, even though there's like a really easy amalgam between, like, if you just replace this violent misogyny with like violent racism, like, we have a big problem with that generally, right? Socially, that would be immediately gone off of every platform. But it takes time. And if you watch sort of Tate on social media, it actually takes a public outcry to get him banned. And so it's not the impetus of the social media platforms to proactively do that. They're like, no, everybody's watching this. We're making dollars right now. And that's like, that's super problematic. And when we talk about, so the paper is really about teachers and young boys and what they're saying in the classroom and saying to teachers. And when we get into that, now we're into this same thing, right? People are like, oh, it's just boys being boys. Yeah, but if those boys were doing racial slurs, they would get suspended or expelled at the, like they just would. But because they're doing sort of passive violence against women, people are like, that's just a thing boys do. What? No. What? That's unbelievable. It should be shocking and horrifying to people. And well, I mean, I guess it is a little bit, because I put out this paper and lots of people have shown interest in it, which is really great. It means that we're paying attention to the issue. But I mean, it takes me sort of getting out here and doing things like this to highlight the fact that this is happening. And I feel like I have to tell people also, this is bad.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a strange thing that has struck me over the last few years, and it's going to sound so silly, but just living life as a woman, I think I oddly gaslit myself at some points into thinking oh, things aren't that bad. And, especially because of how racism permeates our society, how transphobia, especially we're watching the backslide of such integral human rights. And it's easy for me to dismiss the things that the misogynistic things in culture, I think in some ways, because it feels like when it's happening to me, I care less than when it's happening to other people, in the sense that I care so much about protecting other people that I forget sometimes, oh yeah, there's a little bit of marginalization in my community too. And and then it hits you like a ton of bricks. And you kind of I started to notice all the people who really do listen less to women, who really do talk over women in meetings, who take credit for women's work, who, devalue women's work. And it just, and that's all the stuff that creates the context where you then have people dismissing outright violent misogyny as boys will be boys. Because when you live in a culture that so systematically, doesn't listen to women and doesn't, is in such deep denial about the impact of the patriarchy in everything that we say and do, it leads to very clear dismissals of the severe and dangerous ways, and even the minimal ways that impacts our day-to-day life. And that's why I found it really interesting, actually, that your paper specifically looks at the impact on teachers, because on the one hand, and you can tell me if I'm a little off with this premise, but one thing that struck me was I was like, oh, they're sort of one of the only female authority figures these boys will be forced to interact with outside of their mothers. But they're also in a profession that, as you highlighted in the paper, that has been devalued, and that's something that makes them vulnerable, teachers. But overall, it creates a condition where they're sort of on the front lines of this issue, of this battle. I was curious what struck you the most from the stories that you read from the educators when you were looking through the Reddit posts and did this research.
So I think before I talk about that, I want to jump off something you said at the beginning there.
Yeah.
And I know that you mentioned her in the intro, but I really want to make sure that I shout out Emelia Sandau, who is the lead author on this paper, and who is a young woman who is a teacher who is doing really excellent master's work at the University of Toronto right now. And actually, when we started this project, was an undergraduate summer research student. Who has done really, really excellent work, and I really want to shout her out. She's traveling right now, or she would have been able to join us.
Yeah.
But she did really, really excellent work here, and I don't want to be misconstrued as sort of making myself the face of this work that we really did together.
No, we wanted Emelia to be here, folks, but she's traveling, unfortunately. Yeah. So, but shout out to Emelia. You did incredible work here.
Yes, I absolutely. Thank you. I couldn't have articulated it better myself. And I mean, an important thing to, sort of give credit where it's due, and not to be the shiny headed white guy taking the credit for this work. I think the thing as we went through this, and I mean, we were sort of talking before the recording about how there's a lot of things that I do, and because of what you cover, that you do, where we go, yeah, that's a thing. Or we go, oh, that's really interesting, but in a really sort of dark kind of a way. So there wasn't
Mm.
anything that like really surprised me. Um, Except that we had teachers talking about how their male students were making like deeply sexualized comments to their faces,
Wow.
right? So you had young women teachers. So teachers generally, when they were talking about this, is sort of young women identified teachers in like sort of their mid 20s teaching boys in the like 14 to 17, 18 range, where those boys were saying like some creepy shit to like deeply sexualized stuff. And I mean, there's at least one example in the paper, but this is an occasion where Emelia and I, in discussion, were like, which one of these is a good example without being like over the top? I mean, it is an
Yeah.
academic paper after all, right? Like, do you really want to like throw the gnarliest stuff at people? But that I found probably most disturbing in it, because I was young once. I can't imagine myself or anybody I knew saying this kind of shit to a teacher,
Yeah.
right? It's really boggling to me, and that, I mean, that says a lot of things about like the content they're consuming and what they think that means, and perhaps how that's reinforced in the home. We definitely saw that, have seen that in some of our data, because we did this study, and it was some groundwork for some really interesting work that I got to do with some colleagues in New Zealand, and then we're just finishing up 2 studies with Canadian teachers. All the teachers are saying the same thing. This is happening in
Wow.
class. This is the kind of stuff that's happening to me. There's there was just a story on CBC that I was quoted in, and in the text version they have some great quotes from a teacher in Nova Scotia that the wonderful reporter on that talked to, who has some. I mean, that story leads with 2 good examples of like real stuff that happened to her, and so I think that is really something. And you brought up something really, 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 really important about all of this, about the way that we see and understand teachers culturally. And
Yeah.
this is not just Canada, certainly in the United States, in a lot of other places in the world, where we see teaching as care work. And when we see teaching as care work, and people go, yeah, that makes sense. But when we see teaching as care work, it does something really, really important to it socially. And so something that Emelia brought to this as a teacher herself, and studying at OISE at U of T, that teaching is not professionalized in the way that we think it is across the country. So it is a sort of a certified profession in Ontario, but not in every province in Canada,
Mm.
right? And we're talking about Canada.
Yeah.
And so when we are unwilling to recognize teaching as a profession in the same way that we might recognize other professions, and we see it as care work, it allows us to devalue it in really important ways. And you highlighted, there's a section in the paper where we talk about sort of the history of teaching as care work and why it's this way, and why historically more administrators have remained men, even though the vast majority of teachers have been women, and why in the teaching context we might say, oh, well, they're qualified to do this, but they're probably not qualified to do this. Or it's okay for me to send my kid there all day, every day, but I also want to control what that teacher is communicating to them, because I don't think that they're in the right position to be able to do that, even though they have, at the bare minimum, now 6 years of education,
Mm.
post-secondary education, in order to do that. Um, and so it lumps it into the same ways that we might talk about nursing, or allied health professions, for example. So in particular, I'm thinking about PSWs, DSWs, developmental support workers, even recreation therapists, sort of these allied health professions that are mostly done by women and paid for the skill set and the kinds of jobs they have to do in a way that doesn't really compensate them, right? Like, these are
Mm.
people
Yeah.
that are keeping other people alive, and it is a race to the bottom for how much we
Yeah.
pay them. And so, I mean, teaching, I think, through really powerful collective action in Canada and in Ontario is a great example. And a lot of people want to lament sort of the the what teachers make and the teachers union in Ontario, but it's a really powerful example of how collective action can both professionalize and advance a profession that's seen as care work and is done mostly by women. And so
Yeah.
teachers in Ontario have a really powerful lobby, and a lot of people are afraid of that for a variety of reasons that this podcast is not about. But it is something, it's something really important because, I mean, yeah, teachers are carers, but they're also the people who, for the vast majority of us, bring us up in really important ways as we grow up. And so it's complicated. And to see this kind of stuff happen is like, it's really disheartening. And I think it's a little bit scary. And the teachers are saying it's scary.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of also, I think that school is the first, community outside the home that, young people really like significantly engage in and build. And so to see that that's how the female sort of authority figures are being treated in that setting carries lessons and warnings for broader society within it as these boys continue to grow up and continue to internalize the messaging that they're currently internalizing. And it struck me as I was reading the paper that the teachers don't really seem to know, and I can't blame them for this because I don't know, but they don't really seem to know what to do about this. There were a number of different approaches that were explored. Some better than others, like you noted the boys will be boys line. That one sucked ass, but no consensus about what definitively works emerged. There was a lot of like very differing opinions about how to handle this. I wanted to ask you, like, on the one hand, what you think we need to do to help educators navigate this environment, but also how those lessons can be applied to broader society and the sort of warnings and learnings that they carry for all of us.
So big questions.
I know.
And the very first thing I'll do, which is like the most academic thing, which is to go like, solutions are very complex, and
Yes.
I don't have the answer. We know there are some things that don't work, and we know there are some things that maybe can help, but I don't have the answer. The very first thing that we need to do socially, and like Canada-wide, within individual schools, school boards, globally, is acknowledge that this is a thing. This is a thing that's happening, and evidence is mounting. There's some out of Australia, there's some out of the UK, it's coming in the US, there's like work happening here. We've got a couple of studies we're hoping to have some reports out by the end of the summer on. But like it's happening, and we have to acknowledge the fact that this is happening, and also that it's bad.
Yeah.
And I cannot for the life of me, having read, thousands of pages of content in this area, think of a convincing argument that it's okay that any of this is happening, right? Like it's happening, and it's bad, and we can't do anything until we acknowledge that. And
so
I
the
said
boys
earlier,
will be boys argument, that solution's out. We're not going to do the boys will be boys.
That is the biggest crock of shit.
Yeah.
I can't even. Yeah. Boys will be, that is a thing that dudes that want to do sexual violence say, right? Yeah. Like such a bullshit excuse, right? It's the same thing that people say when they want to defend sexual predators. It's this like, oh, well, it's too hard for boys to learn about consent. No, it's not. No, that's stupid.
And you can't tell us that while you're also telling us that men are like better at everything than women, and then tell us that they're not smart enough to learn consent, but they are smarter than us and deserve to be paid more and deserve to be promoted more. And but they're very stupid when it comes to this one thing. It's their flaw.
Yeah, well, no, they're just not wired that way. It's their primeval needs. Bullshit. Get out of here. That's
so insulting to men, frankly. Like,
right? It is so reductionist in the way that we understand. Like, really, if you boil it down, I mean, you highlighted this, right? It's so reductionist in the way that we even understand the like cognitive capacity of men. So don't tell me that men are better at everything, but they don't understand yes or no.
Yeah.
Like, come on. Oh, well, like, I don't really understand how consent works. Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
Yeah, you do. Because if somebody was doing those things to you, you would know pretty quick what consent means, right? And
Yeah.
so, like, all of this, boys will be boys, all of this is just like a bullshit excuse for we don't want to do the work.
Yeah.
Or I'm fine with this. So if as a teacher, teachers, if you're listening and you go to your administrator because some of this bullshit is happening in your class and they're like, oh, I don't know, it's just boys will be boys. That's an excuse. It means one of two things. One, I don't want to help you and I don't want to do the work because I'm lazy as shit. Or two, I agree with them and I think they should be able to do these weird, creepy things to you. Both of those answers are wrong and that person shouldn't have their job anymore. That's
Yeah.
it. It's that simple. So that part of it is that simple. That's not the question you asked me, but you got me all fired up.
Yeah. No, I got fired up too. But
Because
so
I
that's a
can't. Look, I
solution that
can't.
doesn't work.
That's a
Yeah.
solution that doesn't work. Well, it's not even a solution, right? Like I think
Yeah.
it gives
No,
it too much
exactly.
credit to be like, this is a solution. No,
Yeah.
it's not.
Yeah.
So the first thing we have to do, we have to acknowledge that this is a thing and that it's bad, and then we have to start doing something about it. And I want to be really clear about what I say next. I am not pointing my finger at parents to say that, parents, this is your fault. But parents have a really important role to play here. And so parents, you have to be willing to understand what kind of content your children are consuming, whether they are 11. If you're like, my 11-year-old's not getting this stuff, we have evidence in this study that says, yeah, 11-year-olds are getting this content. And that we're not the only study that's saying that. So like you have to be willing to understand or know what your kids are engaging with, and you have to be willing to talk to them about it, and you have to be willing to tell them that it's bad when it's bad. Right? So like work out to get a hard body or make your bed, clean your room. Okay, yeah, okay. But also sexual violence. Not okay, right? Like these are really
Yeah.
simple things that we need to do as parents. And the reason I'm not being like, it's parents' fault, because it's not. The internet is really complicated. Understanding understand the digital literacy of what's happening in social media platforms, etc. It's really, really, really complicated. So parents, you need to spend some time learning about that stuff so that you can help your kids navigate it. Because I think that really is few and far between the people that are like, oh, I'm actually fine with if my kid says like sexualized and derogatory things to their teacher. Right? I don't think that there's actually a lot of people out there that if you like did a poll on the street and we're like, how do you feel about that? They'd be like, nah, that's fine. Right? And so like, let's get to it a little bit here as parents. That digital literacy piece though, that's an educational policy piece. That's a school and school board and government thing that also needs to happen. Educational policy is abysmally slow. Just by all accounts, takes a really long time to get educational policy happening. And then when we do make good progressive decisions, we can roll them right back. The sex ed curriculum in Ontario is a great example. And so if we're not willing to engage with it at the school and educational policy level, then where else can we go? Are the tech companies gonna do work on this area? Clearly not. And so the solution then becomes even more complicated because where do we go for support? There are some great Canadian politicians who are sort of working in this direction. There are great academics who are hoping to highlight these issues that hopefully change is going to happen. But I mean, does it lie then as a kind of citizens initiative to say, well, this is unacceptable in our school spaces? And so, teachers, my heart goes out to you. It's really hard. Your job is hard no matter what.
Yeah.
They have such a super hard job. But to be able to create a space in your classroom where you can say, actually, no. And then, having administrators that those teachers can rely on to support them in those things is really important. And so I presumably some of your listeners will be like, that was a very unsatisfying answer because he didn't tell me what we can do, because I can't. There's a great example
Yeah.
in the paper of a teacher who is like, I didn't know what to do, so I just told the girls to tell the boys why they were wrong. And the girls did that, and then I've never heard about Andrew Tate again since. And that's great for that teacher in that classroom with those students.
Yeah.
And for some teachers, that might work, but there are other teachers, other classrooms, other spaces where that's not going to work. And so, one of the things that teachers are telling us is there are no resources even for us to be able to work in this direction. And it's not about giving a resource that's like, being a toxic man is bad, because I'll tell you, young men, when you're like, we're going to have a workshop about how being a toxic man is bad, they've already stopped listening to me.
Yeah.
So it's about creating a resource that can up our digital literacy, up our ability to understand our impact on others, empathy, etc. It's really complicated, but there are some great folks working in this direction right now. And my research team at the Canadian Institute for Far Right Studies, as well as some other folks out of New Zealand in particular, and the Christchurch Call, continue to work on these things to try and get resources into the hands of people that need them.
Yeah. You know, it's one thing that's striking me as we're having this whole conversation is just, I feel like you and I are talking as we're standing, like, to use a metaphor, we're standing on a beach right now, talking about the fact that the shoreline is receding an abnormal amount, which usually suggests there's a tsunami coming. And, you know, that is what's freaking me out about this, is that, you know, not to diminish the very real and present impact on educators, teachers, because that is a crisis in its own right that deserves full response and full conversation. But I'm terrified for when these kids grow up. You know, like this is a fairly recent phenomenon, and not in general like the themes, but the specific Andrew Tates and these guys are more of a product of the last like 5 years. And it scares me to think about these boys becoming men and entering the world and what that's going to mean. So it's kind of like all the solutions that we're discussing are things that need to be eventually will have to be broadly applied. You know, having people resources for women impacted by this, having, you know, it's having authority figures who are higher up who take these issues seriously. They're all issues that are playing out right now in schools that at some point will play out in broader society, and I'm sure already are in a lot of ways, but it's very unnerving. It feels like we're on the precipice. But I want to tell you my thing. Oh yeah, did you have something you wanted to?
No, that's just really dark,
Yeah,
but
I know.
but also super true.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
It is.
scary.
Yeah.
But you know what's one thing that I like to do? I had our a friend of the show, Kat Abu, who's currently running for Congress in the States, which is incredibly
Mm-hmm.
cool. But she deals with a lot of trolls online. And one thing that she and I talked about a fair bit, because we both kind of deal with the same jerks, was the efficacy of taking away the power from the figureheads in the form of kind of cutting them down a peg. You know, like the thing is I think that one thing that draws a lot of people to these men is they view them as cool. They view them as these like powerful, badass, cool dudes. And I think that's why that one example of the teacher who had the girls, you know, tell the boys why Andrew Tate sucked worked well, because Andrew Tate is telling these boys, girls love me. But then they had girls directly say, no, he's a loser. Like, we would never date
Yeah.
anyone who listens to him. And so I think that actually a hilariously effective tool is just making fun of their kings, these losers, like the figureheads. And I'm not talking about the individual people who are being sucked in. I'm talking about, because often those are people who have a lot of mental health issues, who are struggling in a lot of ways. And I don't think it's necessarily helpful to, you know, hurt them more. But not to excuse the behavior, but, you know, just try to have some understanding of the underlying causes. But the men who are profiting and grifting and at the top levels of these things, I think it's good to mock them a little. And that's why I love things like, as we talked about before we started filming, the Gollum ass picture of Andrew Tate. The, you know, all of these moments where you can just point out that the guy's a loser. He really is, like, to his core. So the last thing I wanted to ask you before we wrap things up is, like, do you have a favorite insult? regarding Andrew Tate?
Um, so like part of me is like, even his nicknames are just so cringe that
Yeah.
I mean, they're like a self own sometimes.
They are.
But my favorite one is actually references him, but is about sort of content in it going. And so there's a in our data, there's a teacher that talks about his followers as tater tots.
Yeah.
Um, and just deep in my soul, that makes me laugh
Yeah.
in a way that is so necessary, because a lot of the work that I do is just kind of filled with a kind of darkness, because I spend a lot of time reading this content, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But somebody should. That isn't sort of part of the community, and so just thinking about them as tater tots, and for some reason that makes me think of him as just like a big tater tot with arms,
I love that.
uh, which I mean, and that's a funny picture in my head,
He kind of
and
looks like
sometimes I
Mr.
need
Potato
that to
Head
like,
sometimes. So I can
oh,
see it,
that's
you know?
good,
And
yeah,
also, but I really like that one too, because I think it also cuts down to the core of what is so exploitative about him, right? Because he is fundamentally an exploitative person. He's exploiting women in his life, and he's exploiting the young men who listen to him, and taking advantage of the fact that they're vulnerable to fill their heads with stuff that is only going to make their lives worse. And so, the tot analogy, like it's like a little kid, is like, that's kind of, it shows like what a predator he is, in the sense that he's targeting people who are vulnerable. So it's like both cutting in the sense that he's a giant potato with arms, but also cutting in the sense that it belies the reality of what he's doing. So I love that.
yeah. And I mean,
Yeah,
the grift is like, it's an MLM, right? It's the
it
same
is.
sort of thing as an MLM. It's
Yeah,
really nothing. There's nothing new going on here. He just has found the right angle at the right time.
yeah.
I think that, yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
like
no,
I
that's
like the
one of my
big
biggest
potato
through
though.
lines with the extremism coverage that I've done, has been the fact that I really do think they're all like pyramid schemes, finding vulnerable people, because that's what happens. Like, who ends up selling the Mary Kay or the Monat, or, whatever else is an MLM? Sorry, these guys are really sensitive about being called pyramid schemes.
They
But
really are. Yeah.
they
Oh yeah.
really are. So to be clear, MLMs, but, they seek out like, uh, mothers who are working at home, who are, don't have a huge social circle and are feeling really isolated and want to feel like they're contributing, want to feel like they have a community. And one of the things that makes it so hard to leave is the fact that they get that community, but it is contingent on the toxicity, or the, in that case, sales. But in this case that we're discussing in this episode, it's misogyny. So that makes it really hard to kick it. And I think that, it's really powerful to think of them as pyramid schemes, or as MLMs, because that's what is happening to these people. So,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think that the way that you describe those sort of two things as, sort of same but different,
Yeah.
is absolutely right. It's absolutely right.
Yeah. Well, Luke, I could honestly talk to you about this all day long, because I think it's so interesting in a horrifying way, like we were talking about earlier. But I should probably cut myself off. Before I let you go, though, is there anywhere that people can keep up with you? I'm sure that after listening to you speak for the last 45 minutes, they're like, this guy knows what's up. I want to read more of his stuff. I want to keep up with him. Where can they do that?
Well, I'm not super active on social media, and part of
That's
the reason is
okay.
that I did a dissertation on social media and was like, nope, I'm
That's
out of
so
here.
fair.
So I have a Blue Sky, which I am on sometimes, so people can find me there. It's just my name. I was early in, so I got just my name. .bluesky.social, and then yeah, I mean, if you Google me, you'll get my stuff. A couple of pieces from a couple of years ago in the conversation, but all of my academic work, if ever, this is true not just of me, but of all academics pretty much, if ever you want to read something we wrote and it's behind a paywall, just email us directly. We will so happily send you that thing for no money. We will just email you right to you, because well, academic publishing, which is maybe all I'll say about that
Yeah.
right now, because this is not about that. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean that's pretty much it. And you can certainly come on over to the Canadian Institute for Far Right Studies website and check us out there. Some content there, some blog stuff there that you can read. The website is cifrs.org. And so you can come and check out the work that we are doing there, myself and my great colleagues that are part of that network.
Awesome. Well, Luc, thank you so much for your time today. This was an awesome conversation.
Thanks so much. I really had a good time. I appreciate being here.
Me too. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Bubble Pop. I'm Rachel Gilmore, your least favorite person's least favorite journalist. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing on YouTube, Patreon, Substack, or wherever you like to listen. You can also find me on TikTok, Instagram, Twitch, and Blue Sky. I'd like to give a special thank you to Hans Vivian Wenzel for making the incredibly groovy music for Bubble Pop. You can find more of his stuff on Spotify under the artist name Hans. That's a lowercase h with an exclamation mark. Thank you again for spending this time with me. This is my dream job. I know I say that every week, but that's because it's true every week, and I couldn't do it for 1 second without your support. So thank you, and I'll see you next time.